It was a typical evening in New York City. The sun had just begun to set, casting an orange glow over the skyline. Margaret, an elderly woman in her early 70s, walked slowly towards the subway station. She had spent the day with her granddaughter, laughing and reminiscing about old times. As she made her way through the busy streets, she smiled to herself, thankful for the family she had and the memories they shared. Her day had been perfect, but she was looking forward to getting home and resting. Margaret's steps were slow but steady as she entered the subway station. The platform was crowded with commuters, some rushing to catch their trains, others scrolling through their phones, lost in the rhythm of the city. She paused at the edge of the platform and waited for the next train, clutching her small purse tightly. It wasn't much, just a few dollars, her ID, and a photo of her late husband, but it was everything she needed for the evening. The train finally pulled into the station with a loud screech. Margaret stepped back as the doors opened, letting the crowd of passengers exit before she carefully boarded. She made her way to a vacant seat near the middle of the car and settled in, her tired legs grateful for the rest. She had just pulled out a small book when the train doors closed with a soft thud, and the train began to move, humming softly as it headed toward her stop. Unbeknownst to Margaret, the subway car was also home to someone else, someone who had no interest in books or enjoying a quiet evening ride. A young man, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans, stood near the door, eyeing the passengers around him. His gaze moved over the people in the car, stopping briefly on the elderly woman who had settled in her seat. His eyes narrowed as he looked at her purse. He was tall, perhaps in his late 20s, and he looked nervous, constantly glancing around as if he was unsure of what he was about to do. His mind raced with thoughts of how he had ended up in this situation. He didn't have a job, and he was struggling to make ends meet. He'd made bad decisions before, and now, here he was, planning to make another mistake. The subway seemed like the perfect opportunity. The young man's hands clenched into fists as the train rattled along the tracks. He hadn't planned on robbing anyone today, but when he saw the elderly woman sitting alone with her purse in her lap, he couldn't resist. She seemed so vulnerable, so unaware of the world around her. He glanced again at her purse, imagining the cash and cards inside. Just one quick grab, and he would be out of here, his problems temporarily solved. Margaret, lost in her book, didn't notice the young man's focus on her. She was used to the busy streets of New York and the constant motion of the subway. She wasn't worried about anything, just enjoying the quiet moment before she reached her stop. She adjusted her glasses and continued reading, her mind far away from the dangers that lurked in the shadows. As the train passed through tunnels and stations, the young man grew bolder. His heart pounded in his chest. He watched the elderly woman closely, waiting for the right moment. He had to move fast. He had done this before, but never with so many people around. The other passengers seemed oblivious to what was about to happen. Everyone was lost in their own world. Finally, the moment arrived. The train slowed as it approached the next station, the doors opening to let passengers out. The young man took a deep breath, his hand reaching for Margaret's purse. He wasn't sure if anyone had noticed him yet. His fingers grazed the strap, and for a split second, he hesitated. But then the doors closed, and the train began to move again. There was no turning back now. As Margaret shifted in her seat, she felt a slight tug on her purse. The young man had pulled it from her lap, and before she could react, he was darting toward the door. In an instant, he was running toward the exit, trying to escape without anyone noticing. But what he didn't know was that someone had already noticed, someone who wasn't about to let him get away. The young man's heart raced as he sprinted toward the subway doors. He could hear the sound of his own breath, quick and heavy, as the train sped through the tunnels. His hands gripped Margaret's purse tightly, the weight of his actions starting to settle in. But all he could think about was escaping. He had to get out before anyone could stop him. Margaret, who had been sitting peacefully just moments before, now felt a sudden, sharp tug on her purse. It was an unexpected jolt, And before she could even process what was happening, she saw the thief darting towards the door, his face hidden under the hood of his jacket. She gasped, not fully understanding what was going on. Her mind struggled to keep up with the shock of the moment. "Hey," she called out, her voice shaking with surprise. "Stop." But the young man didn't turn back. His focus was entirely on escaping. As he reached the subway doors, he glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was in pursuit. The train was coming to a stop at the next station, and he knew this was his chance to slip out unnoticed. He could already see the platform ahead, the bright lights shining through the doors. The other passengers had only just started to realize what had happened. Some of them stared, confused and unsure of how to react. Others quickly stood up, trying to assess the situation. One man stood near the door, unsure whether to chase after the thief. A woman beside Margaret looked around nervously, but no one seemed ready to take action. But then, there was a movement in the back of the train. A man in a black jacket, sitting by the window, stood up. His face was calm, yet there was something about his presence that drew everyone's attention. It was as if time had slowed down for a moment. People turned their heads to see what would happen next. This man was none other than KEANU Reeves. He had been sitting quietly, trying to enjoy a peaceful ride home. He hadn't noticed the thief at first, but when he heard Margaret's shout and saw the young man running toward the doors, everything changed. Without hesitation, KEANU stood up, his movements swift and controlled. The thief had no idea who was watching him, or that he was about to face someone who wasn't going to let him get away. KEANU's eyes locked on the thief as he moved toward him. He wasn't about to let this crime go unchallenged. Not in his presence. There were no dramatic speeches, no complicated plans. KEANU's actions spoke for themselves. He simply moved with purpose, stepping through the crowded subway car, his steps steady and sure. As the thief reached for the door handle, ready to bolt out into the station, KEANU closed the distance between them. In a quick but powerful move, he grabbed the thief by the arm, yanking him back toward the center of the train. The young man struggled, surprised by the strength of the grip. He tried to break free, but KEANU held on firmly, not letting him go. The train's brakes squealed as it slowed to a stop, and the doors opened to reveal the station. But the thief wasn't going anywhere. The passengers who had been quietly watching now gasped in surprise, their eyes wide with shock and curiosity. Some of them began to whisper, recognizing the calm, confident man who had just stopped the thief in his tracks. The young man was caught, trapped in the middle of the train, and all he could do was glare at KEANU. He was still trying to pull away, but KEANU's grip was unyielding. Margaret, still sitting in her seat, watched in disbelief. She had no idea what was happening, but she was starting to feel a little less afraid. "Let me go," the thief spat, his voice desperate. "I didn't mean." But KEANU wasn't listening to the excuses. Instead, he calmly spoke, his voice steady and calm despite the chaos around him. "You're not going anywhere. You've got to answer for what you've done." The thief was breathing heavily now, trying to come up with something to say. But his words seemed to vanish in the face of KEANU's presence. It was as if the man's calm confidence was enough to diffuse the tension in the air. The other passengers looked on in stunned silence, some even beginning to pull out their phones to record the unexpected turn of events. Margaret, who was still trying to process what had just happened, took a deep breath. She glanced down at her purse, which had been returned to her without a second thought. She felt a sense of relief wash over her, but also something else. Gratitude. She looked up at KEANU, who was still holding the thief firmly, but without aggression. "Thank you," she whispered softly, not quite sure what to say. KEANU gave her a small, reassuring smile, as if to say everything was going to be okay. And then, just as quickly as the tension had built, it began to fade. The thief continued to struggle, trying to wriggle out of KEANU's grasp, but no matter how much he tugged, KEANU's hold was firm. His hand, strong and steady, didn't let go. The young man was shocked. He hadn't expected someone to stop him, especially not someone who seemed so calm and composed. His heart raced, and his mind spun. He had been caught. It was over. The other passengers on the subway, who had been watching the scene unfold, were now fully aware of what had just happened. Some of them exchanged looks of disbelief, while others whispered to each other, but no one made a move to intervene. They all seemed to be frozen, stunned by what they were witnessing. Margaret, still sitting in her seat, watched in awe. She had been through a lot in her life, but this was a moment she would never forget. The fear she had felt moments ago was slowly being replaced by relief. The thief hadn't gotten away. Her purse was safe, and in the midst of this unexpected chaos, a hero had stepped in to make everything right. KEANU glanced around the subway car, his eyes briefly meeting those of the other passengers. They all seemed to recognize him now, as whispers of his name began to spread. But he didn't let it distract him. He was focused on the thief in front of him. With a calm voice, KEANU spoke. "You've made a mistake," KEANU said, his tone not angry, but firm. "But you don't have to make it worse." The thief, still trying to break free, stopped for a moment. He looked up at KEANU, confusion written all over his face. The words didn't seem to register. "What?" the thief said, his voice cracking. "What do you mean? Let me go." KEANU shook his head slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you, but you can't just take from others and run. There are consequences." The thief didn't seem to understand. He had been in a desperate situation. He hadn't been thinking clearly when he grabbed Margaret's purse. He didn't think anyone would stop him. And now, here he was, trapped in the middle of a subway car, with a man who was not only stronger than he'd expected, but also surprisingly kind. "Why are you doing this?" KEANU asked, his voice softening a little. "You don't have to live like this." The young man hesitated. His breath was still heavy from the chase, and his hands were shaking. I don't know," he muttered. "I don't have a job. I can't afford anything. I thought, maybe just one quick grab, and I could get by." KEANU nodded slowly, his expression calm and understanding. "I get it," he said. "Life can be tough, but stealing isn't the way to solve your problems. There are other ways." The thief's eyes flickered with confusion. He wasn't used to hearing kindness in situations like this. His entire life, he had only ever known judgment, harsh words, and anger. He didn't know how to process what KEANU was saying. For a brief moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. KEANU looked down at the purse in his hand and gently handed it back to Margaret, who had been watching the conversation quietly. "Here you go," he said, offering her a reassuring smile. Margaret took the purse, her hands still trembling slightly. She looked up at KEANU with gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. You're a hero." KEANU shook his head, as if brushing off the praise. "I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone should do," he said with humility. He turned back to the thief, his voice steady. "You don't have to steal. You can ask for help. There are places, programs, people who want to help you. You just need to reach out." The thief's eyes widened slightly. He had never really thought about asking for help before. He had always tried to handle things on his own, in ways he now realized weren't working. The thought of reaching out to someone else, of finding a way to do things differently, was both frightening and freeing. KEANU continued, "You're not alone. You just need to make the right choice from here on out." The thief's shoulders sagged. He didn't know what to say. He was ashamed, confused, and embarrassed. But something in KEANU's words, his calm, understanding tone, had made an impact. The train pulled into the next station, and the doors opened. The thief stood still for a moment, his mind racing. He looked at KEANU, who nodded toward the door. "Get off here," KEANU suggested gently. "Take a moment. Think about what you want to do next." The thief didn't run. He didn't try to escape. Instead, he stepped toward the doors, his head lowered. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might be able to change things for himself. KEANU smiled back, shrugging. Sometimes we all need a little help. And with that, the subway doors closed, and the train moved on, carrying the passengers toward their destinations. But for Margaret and the young man, things would never be quite the same. The train rumbled along the tracks, moving through the dark tunnels beneath New York City. Margaret sat quietly, still processing the strange turn of events. She couldn't believe how her peaceful ride had suddenly become a scene from a movie. But what had stuck with her most was how KEANU had handled the situation. He wasn't angry or aggressive, but calm and understanding. It was as if he had known exactly what to do, and had done it without hesitation. KEANU, on the other hand, had settled back into his seat after the thief had left. He wasn't looking for attention, and he certainly wasn't expecting any praise. He just wanted to finish his journey home. But as he looked around, he noticed something interesting. The other passengers who had been watching the situation unfold were now quietly whispering among themselves, glancing at him with wide eyes. It was clear they had recognized him. KEANU didn't mind the attention. He was used to it by now. But what surprised him was how the whole situation had turned out. He hadn't expected to be involved in a crime like that, and certainly not in such a public way. Yet, somehow, he had managed to step in without thinking twice. It felt like a natural reaction, and he was glad he could help. But now he couldn't help but wonder how the thief would move forward. Margaret, still holding her purse tightly, looked over at KEANU. She had been trying to decide how to express her gratitude. There was something about his presence that made her feel at ease, even after everything that had happened. It wasn't just that he had saved her purse. It was the way he had spoken to the thief, the kindness he had shown. "Thank you again," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "You didn't have to do that, but I'm so glad you did." KEANU smiled kindly, but there was something in his eyes that showed he wasn't looking for recognition. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. "I'm just glad everything worked out," he replied. "I didn't do much, really. Anyone would have stepped in." But Margaret shook her head gently. "Not everyone would have. Not like you did. You stayed calm. You didn't make it worse. I'm sure that young man will think about this, maybe change his ways." KEANU glanced toward the doors, his expression thoughtful. "I hope so. Sometimes, people just need a reminder that there's always another way, a better way." Margaret nodded. She was about to say something else when she was interrupted by a few passengers who had been sitting nearby. One of them, a young woman in her 20s, stood up and walked over to KEANU. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said hesitantly, "but I just have to say, I saw what happened, and you were incredible. I don't know if I would have had the courage to do what you did." KEANU gave her a small, polite smile, but before he could respond, another voice chimed in. This time, it was an older man, sitting a few seats behind Margaret. "Yeah, I couldn't believe my eyes," the man said, grinning. "I mean, I've seen action movies, but this was something else. You really handled that situation like a pro." KEANU chuckled lightly, his calm demeanor not changing. "I just did what needed to be done. No big deal." But the passengers weren't done. As the train continued to roll toward its destination, more people began to approach KEANU, offering their praise and admiration. It became clear that everyone in the car had seen the moment, and many had even recorded it on their phones. By the time they reached the next station, there were murmurs in the crowd. Some people recognized KEANU, and some didn't, but everyone could agree on one thing. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. Margaret, who had been sitting quietly, listening to the conversation, felt a little shy. She hadn't expected KEANU to be so humble about everything. She had seen so many stories in the news about celebrities who craved attention, but here was someone who had stepped in to help without looking for the spotlight. As the train pulled into the next station, Margaret stood up to leave. "Goodbye, and thank you again," she said, her voice warm with appreciation. KEANU nodded back, his eyes meeting hers. "Take care," he said simply. "I'm glad everything's okay." With that, Margaret exited the train, still a little shaken but grateful. The story of the subway thief and the calm hero who had stepped in would stay with her for a long time. And in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but feel a little more hopeful about the world. KEANU sat back down in his seat, his eyes on the floor as he thought about the events of the evening. He didn't know what would happen to the thief, or whether he would take KEANU's words to heart. But he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, it only takes a small act of kindness to make a difference. And in a world that often seemed dark and uncertain, that was something worth holding on to. As the subway doors closed behind Margaret, KEANU sat back in his seat, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The train moved on, its steady rhythm matching the calm that had taken over the car. He could still hear the whispers of the other passengers, their excitement buzzing in the air, but KEANU was lost in his own thoughts. He didn't mind the attention. He had seen it many times before. But tonight, it felt different. There was something special about helping someone who truly needed it, something that made him feel good inside. The train rattled down the tracks, passing through more stations, but KEANU barely noticed the stops. His mind kept returning to the thief. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen to the young man. Would he take the chance to turn his life around, or would he continue down the path of poor choices? KEANU had seen a lot of people in difficult situations. In his line of work, he had met all kinds of individuals, from people who had it all to those who had lost everything. He knew that everyone had their struggles, but the difference between the ones who found a way out and those who didn't was the willingness to change. It wasn't always easy, but it was possible. As the train slowed to a stop at the next station, KEANU stood up. He was getting close to his destination, and he didn't want to be late. He made his way toward the doors, ready to exit, when he noticed something strange. The thief, the young man who had tried to rob Margaret, was standing just outside the train car, waiting near the platform. KEANU stopped for a moment, watching the young man from a distance. The thief didn't notice him at first, his back turned as he nervously looked around. KEANU felt a surge of curiosity and almost instinctively stepped off the train. He walked toward the thief slowly, not sure what he planned to do, but feeling like he couldn't walk away just yet. The young man noticed KEANU approaching, and his eyes widened in surprise. He quickly glanced down, as if trying to avoid eye contact, but KEANU stopped in front of him and gave a gentle smile. "I didn't expect to see you here," KEANU said, his voice calm. The young man shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I didn't know what to do. I thought I could just get away, you know. But then I don't know." KEANU nodded, understanding the uncertainty in his voice. "I know how it feels," he said. "You make a bad choice, and it seems like there's no way out. But there is always a way." The young man looked up, his eyes uncertain. "You really think so?" "I know so," KEANU replied. "Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is what you do next. You don't have to keep making the same mistakes." For a moment, the young man was silent, lost in thought. KEANU could see the struggle in his eyes, the fear, the confusion, the shame. It wasn't easy to admit that you had made a mistake, especially when you had been living in a world that seemed to offer no other options. But KEANU knew that sometimes, all a person needed was someone who believed they could change. "Look," KEANU continued, "I'm not going to pretend I know everything about your life. But I do know that you don't have to face it alone. There are people out there who can help, who can show you a different path. You just have to reach out." The young man looked at the ground, his shoulders slumped. "I don't know if I can do that. I've made so many wrong choices. I don't think anyone will believe me." KEANU crouched down so he was eye level with him, trying to make him feel heard. "I believe you," he said simply. "I believe you can make the right choice, and I'm not the only one." The young man stared at KEANU for a moment, taking in his words. For the first time, a flicker of hope appeared in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something that told KEANU this wasn't the end, but a new beginning. I'm sorry, the young man said quietly, his voice full of regret. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just didn't know what else to do. KEANU smiled, standing up. It's okay. With a final look of encouragement, KEANU turned and started to walk away, heading toward the stairs that led up to the street level. The young man stood there, watching him go, his thoughts racing. He didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. As KEANU walked away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had done more than stop a crime that night. He had offered someone a chance for a new beginning, and that was something that would stick with him forever. For the young man, this moment would be the turning point, the beginning of a journey toward something better. And KEANU knew that, sometimes, all it took was one small act of kindness to change the course of someone's life. The next few days passed slowly for the young man. He had a lot to think about. After his encounter with KEANU, something inside him had shifted. He couldn't stop thinking about the kind words KEANU had spoken. There's always a way. The words echoed in his mind over and over. It was hard for him to believe, but the more he thought about it, the more he felt like maybe KEANU was right. Maybe he could make a change. The young man, whose name was Jason, had always found himself stuck in a cycle. He had grown up with very little, and the streets had become his home. It was easy to slip into bad habits, and the temptation to steal, to take what he needed without asking, seemed like the only option. But now, after talking to KEANU, Jason wasn't so sure anymore. For the first time, he realized that there might be another way, a better way. Jason sat on the same park bench where he had spent many sleepless nights before. The city was busy around him, but he felt oddly peaceful. He wasn't sure what his next step should be, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep living like this. He had to try something different. The memory of KEANU's calm voice, his quiet encouragement, gave him a little hope. Maybe he could find a way out of this mess. But where to start? Jason didn't have much. A few worn-out clothes, a backpack with some food, and his old sneakers. He had nothing to his name except the burden of regret. He couldn't remember the last time someone had told him that things could get better. It felt strange, like a foreign idea, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Jason decided that he would try something he had never done before. He would ask for help. The next morning, Jason made his way to a local community center. He had passed it many times before, but he had never gone inside. Today, though, was different. Today, he was going to take a step toward changing his life. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it was the right thing to do. When he walked through the doors of the community center, he felt nervous. The walls were lined with posters of programs designed to help people in need. Job training, housing assistance, addiction counseling. It was a place where people could get back on their feet. Jason had never thought he was the type of person who would ask for help, but now he wasn't so sure. Maybe he could find something here to give him a fresh start. He approached the front desk, where a friendly woman with short brown hair greeted him. "Hi there. How can I help you today?" Jason cleared his throat, feeling a little shy. I'm not really sure where to start. I need help." The woman smiled warmly. "That's exactly what we're here for. We can help with a lot of things. Finding a job, getting a place to stay, even just talking if you need someone to listen. What can we help you with today?" Jason hesitated. He had never been good at asking for help, but KEANU's words echoed in his mind, giving him the courage to speak up. "I need a job. I don't have much experience, but I want to change. I want to do better." The woman's smile widened. "That's a great first step. You've come to the right place. We have job training programs that could be a good fit for you. Let me get you signed up." Jason felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't going to be easy, he knew that. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had made the right choice. He wasn't sure how it would all turn out, but he was willing to try. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Over the next few weeks, Jason worked hard to follow through on the opportunity he had found. He attended job training sessions, learned new skills, and started applying for jobs. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he felt discouraged, but each time he wanted to give up. He remembered KEANU's calm face and the way he had spoken to him on the subway. "You don't have to do this by yourself." That kept him going. One afternoon, while he was walking home from work, Jason passed by the subway station where everything had started. He paused for a moment, remembering the day he had tried to steal Margaret's purse and how KEANU had stopped him. It felt like a lifetime ago. But now, instead of shame, Jason felt something different: gratitude. He had taken the first step toward turning his life around. And even though the road ahead was still long and uncertain, he knew that as long as he kept trying, he could make it. He wasn't the same person he had been before. He was someone who had learned that change was possible, and with hard work and a little help, anything was possible. Jason smiled to himself as he walked away from the subway station. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The future didn't seem so dark anymore. It felt like there was light at the end of the tunnel, and he was finally on his way toward it. A few months had passed since Jason had made the decision to change his life, and things were starting to look brighter. He had kept working hard at the cafe, saving up a little money, and attending job training. The sense of hope KEANU had sparked in him was still there, like a light guiding him through the dark times. Jason's mornings had become a new routine. He would wake up early, take a quick shower, and head to the cafe for his shift. He'd serve coffee, clean tables, and chat with regular customers who were kind enough to strike up conversations. The job wasn't glamorous, but Jason didn't mind. He was learning responsibility and discipline, two things that had been missing from his life before. On his days off, he'd go back to the community center for job training. He had learned how to write a resume, practice interviews, and even manage his finances. There were still moments when it felt overwhelming, but Jason kept reminding himself that he had made it this far, and he could keep going. One day, while Jason was on his lunch break at the cafe, a regular customer came in. The man, an older gentleman with glasses, had been coming to the cafe for months. He had always been kind to Jason, asking about his day and offering a friendly word when he could. Today, as Jason brought him his usual order of black coffee, the man smiled at him. "You've been working here for a while now, haven't you?" the man asked, his voice soft and friendly. "Yeah, about 6 months now," Jason replied, wiping his hands on a towel. "It's been good. I'm learning a lot." The man nodded, as if he could see the change in Jason. "I've been noticing something in you. There's a difference in the way you carry yourself now. You seem more confident." Jason smiled modestly. "I'm just trying to do my best." The man studied him for a moment before continuing. "You know, I own a small business just down the street. I've been thinking about hiring someone part-time to help with the office work. Would you be interested?" Jason's heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of opportunity he had dreamed about, but never thought would come his way. "I'd be really interested," he said, trying to hide the excitement in his voice. The man smiled. "Great. Why don't you stop by my office tomorrow after your shift, and we'll talk about it?" Jason could hardly believe it. He had been working so hard to improve his skills, and now here was a chance to do something even better. A part-time office job was exactly the kind of work he had been hoping for. It meant he could learn new skills, earn a better paycheck, and take another step toward the future he had been working so hard to build. That night, Jason couldn't sleep. The next day, Jason walked to the office after his shift, his heart racing. When he arrived, the man greeted him with a warm handshake and led him into a small but tidy office. They talked for nearly an hour about the job, and the man asked Jason about his past experience and skills. Jason shared what he had learned at the community center and the skills he had developed at the cafe. It wasn't much, but the man seemed impressed with his determination and willingness to learn. "I think you'll be a great fit for the job," the man said with a smile. "We'll start you part-time, and if things go well, there's room for more work in the future." Jason felt a rush of gratitude and excitement. "Thank you so much. I won't let you down." Over the next few weeks, Jason began working part-time at the office. It wasn't easy at first. He had to learn new tasks and adjust to a different kind of work, but he took everything in stride. Slowly, he grew more comfortable with the job. The office work was quiet and required focus, but Jason found a sense of satisfaction in completing each task. He also enjoyed the steady pay, which allowed him to start saving for his own place. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One afternoon, after finishing a task at the office, Jason sat at his desk, taking a deep breath. He thought about everything he had been through, the struggles, the mistakes, the moments of doubt. He remembered the subway, the thief, and KEANU's words. "There's always a way." It was amazing to him how far he had come, how much had changed in just a few months. Jason wasn't the same person he had been when he first made that decision to turn his life around. He was stronger now, more confident, and ready for whatever came next. He knew that the road ahead would still have challenges, but he was no longer afraid. With hard work, patience, and a little help from others, anything was possible. And as Jason sat at his desk, a sense of peace settled over him. He had made it this far, and with every step, he was getting closer to the life he had always wanted. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, in a long time, that was enough. A year had passed since Jason had first stepped into the cafe, the place that had changed everything for him. His life had transformed in ways he hadn't even imagined possible. He had a steady job, a small apartment, and most importantly, a sense of hope. He no longer felt like he was just surviving. He was living, building a future for himself. Jason often thought back to the day he had met KEANU on the subway. It had been a turning point, a moment when everything in his life seemed to change with just a few words of encouragement. He still couldn't believe that someone like KEANU had cared enough to speak to him, to stop him from making a terrible mistake. It was as if KEANU had given him a second chance, a chance to choose a better path. And Jason had taken it. One afternoon, as Jason was closing up the cafe after a busy day, he received a phone call from the man who had hired him at the office. The older gentleman had become a good mentor to Jason, offering him advice on both work and life. He had even helped him improve his resume and find better opportunities. "Jason," the man said, his voice friendly as always, "I got something for you. We've been so impressed with your work that we want to offer you a full-time position. We think you're ready for more responsibility. How do you feel about that?" Jason's heart skipped a beat. A full-time job. He had been hoping for this moment, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. "I'd be honored," Jason replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "I'll give it everything I've got." Over the next few weeks, Jason settled into his new role. The office work was more demanding, but Jason found that he enjoyed the challenge. He was learning new skills every day, and the people at the office were kind and supportive. His confidence grew with each task he completed. He had finally found a place where he felt valued, where his efforts were appreciated. As the months went by, Jason continued to work hard. He started taking courses online to further improve his skills, something he had never considered before. He was determined to keep moving forward, to never stop growing. The future seemed wide open, and Jason was ready to embrace whatever came next. One day, while Jason was on his lunch break, he bumped into an old acquaintance from his past. It was a man he had known from the streets, someone he had used to hang out with before he had decided to turn his life around. The man, whose name was Mark, didn't seem to recognize him at first. His face was weathered, and he looked like he hadn't changed much. He still had that same hard look in his eyes. When Mark finally saw Jason, his eyes widened in surprise. "Jason, is that really you?" he asked. Jason nodded, a small smile forming on his face. Yeah, it's me. It's been a while. Mark looked him up and down, clearly shocked by how different Jason looked. Man, you've cleaned up. What happened? You're not hanging out on the streets anymore. Jason shrugged, his smile never fading. No, I'm not. I've got a job now. I've been working at the office for a while. Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. That's crazy, man. I remember when you were just like the rest of us, struggling to get by. It's good to see you've turned things around. Jason nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of his past. It wasn't easy, he said quietly, but I had to make a choice. I wanted to do something better with my life. Mark looked thoughtful for a moment. I wish I could say the same. Life's been tough. Man, I've got nothing. You've done well for yourself. Mark shook his head, his expression hardening. I don't know, man. I've been on my own for too long. It's hard to ask for help. Jason felt a pang of sympathy for him. He knew that asking for help had been one of the hardest things he had ever done, but he also knew that it was the first step toward a better life. I get it, Jason said softly. But I was there once too. It's okay to ask for help. It's the first step toward change. Mark looked at Jason for a long moment, his face unreadable. Maybe you're right, he muttered. Maybe I'll think about it. Jason gave him an encouraging smile. You don't have to do it alone. There's always a way out, just like there was for me. As Jason walked away, he couldn't help but think about how far he had come. Just a year ago, he had been on the streets, unsure of what the future held. But now he had a job, a place to live, and a sense of purpose. And maybe, just maybe, he could help someone else find their way too. It wasn't always easy, but Jason had learned that no matter how difficult life might get, there was always hope. He had chosen to make a change, and now he was living proof that anything was possible. And with that knowledge, he walked forward, ready for whatever came next, knowing that the future was full of endless possibilities.